If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? I wish I'd written that, but I didn't. Joy Davidman wrote that. Helen Joy Davidman Gresham Lewis wrote that in about 1947 in an essay on fear. It was at the front of a book called Smoke on the Mountain, which she wrote about the 10 Commandments. And I read that question, and not only did I love the question as a woman and as a human, but as a writer, I loved the structure of it because the two words were put in the exact right place. If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? So the sentence wasn't just this kind of intriguing idea, but she put those words where they needed to be. You know, all these, inspirational quotes about because we're brave, we're warrior goddesses, we can conquer. Those can be true, but most of the time, or for me, I feel like I need to grow into it. I'm not quite there yet, and probably never will be. And the word becoming, what a great word. Because aren't we constantly becoming? And that's where the title of the book came from. So I rushed through this essay, wanting the answer to what would become of us if we should ever grow brave. And I didn't find it. She didn't answer it. And then I realized that that's because she answered it with her life. Joy Davidman wrote that question and then answered it with every decision she made thereafter. Every decision she made, she was answering the question, what will become of me if I should grow brave? And this set her off on a 10-year transformational journey that not only changed her life, her heart, her work, and her family, but the life and the work and the heart and the family of our most beloved author, C.S. Lewis. So in her making those choices, it just didn't affect her life. It affected his and therefore ours. So we all fall into our own kind of love with C.S. Lewis. Can I get an amen? I had to follow Andrew. I had to do that. So I fell into mine when I was 12 years old. I'm a preacher's kid with all the things that means. And my dad's office was lined with C.S. Lewis books. And I found the Screw Tape Letters when I was 12 years old. You should not read the Screw Tape Letters when you're 12 years old. At least I shouldn't have. I knew that Satan was behind every bush and I was a parent. It was about the same time that, what was Peretti's book? The Present Darkness. Yeah, those came out at the same time. I read them at the same time. But then I fell through the wardrobe door of Narnia. And then I read everything Lewis wrote, or as much as I could have. I think you can't read everything he wrote. And I fell in love with his work and who he was. And he meant different things to me at different times in my life. Because I believe that books are living things. For those of us that write and those of us that read and care, books are living things. We can read them at one stage in our life and it means something, and we can read it at another stage in our life and it means something else altogether. And that also happened to Joy. But I've been reading his work all my life. So I might love him, but he only loved one woman enough to marry. Only one woman he called earth, stars, air, and water. Only one woman, yeah, I get called that all the time. Only one woman enough that when you read A Grief Observed, you ask yourself, who was this poet and novelist that so enchanted Lewis that it broke him in this way? I think it was Max McLean who said it was a shattering of Lewis. And I love that term because it was. The way he fell in love with her was a shattering. So who was she? So why hadn't I heard that much about her? Why, if we know her at all, do we know her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis? Why do we see her as the woman who broke his heart? Maybe because it's easier to put her in a box. Maybe it's because it's easier to put anybody in a box and say, this is who they are. I'm going to keep them there and put them there. The movie Shadowlands, I think we've all seen it, right? So this is always a fun fact for me. 6 months after Anthony Hopkins played C.S. Lewis, he played Hannibal Lecter. So anyway, You see this movie and you're deeply moved, or I was deeply moved. And yet I realized later in life, it's entirely about how her death affected Lewis. It doesn't tell us anything about her except she was a poet and she died well and brave and loved Lewis with all of her heart. So why did we put her in that box? Joy was a fiery, intelligent woman who made this transformational journey from New York to London to Oxford, back to New York, back to London, back to Oxford. She was a genius. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. So Joy and Jack's love story was 10 years long, and it spurred and changed Lewis's work. She was his muse, his co-author, his best friend, and we'll talk a lot more about that today with Andrew. So why do we constantly talk about the woman behind the man? I'm going to make you vow right here. We're going to stop that. We're going to talk about the woman beside the man. Can I get an amen? All right, thank you. I got a couple amens. So I started doing my research on Joy Davidman. Who was she beyond this woman? And I realized that there were two conflicting narratives about Joy Davidman. There were almost two Joy Davidman camps. Over here, we had the camp of a brash New York woman. I'm just going to start here by saying I despise the word brash, so we're going to go from there. This brash New York woman who inserted herself into Lewis's life. Fooled him, because Lewis is so foolable. Fooled Lewis, fooled Warnie, and just shoved herself into their life. Then over here, I found the camp of these people who knew of her brilliance, of her bold personality, of her genius. Lewis would say she was not only the smartest woman he ever met, but the smartest person he ever met. They played Scrabble in every language. They were both sight readers and sight memorizers. They could quote whole passages of books by memory. They both had read the same books. They were both geniuses. I don't think anybody was pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. But I couldn't reconcile the difference between these two camps I was hearing about. And I knew I was going to write about her, but I didn't know how. And I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that she enchanted me and that she was interesting. So very early on, I decided I was tired of hearing about her, and I only wanted to hear from her. And that's when I knew the kind of book I would write about her. I decided that I was going to write from behind her eyes. I was going to write from the seat of her heart. The phrase I had on my computer and on my bulletin board was, in the key of empathy. I wanted to write about Joy Davidman from her words, her language, in the key of empathy. And I can do that, or could do that, in whatever meager way I've done, because Joy was a prolific writer. We have her letters, her poetry, her essays. I didn't have to guess what Joy Davidman thought about the world. She tells us what she thinks about the world. She changes, but she tells us. I did not have to guess. So I dove into her work. I started reading her essays. I started reading her novels, her poetry. Her letters are incredible. There is a published book of her letters, and they are better than any journal you could read. She writes as if she's writing a short story in every letter she writes. Her descriptive language, how she feels, what she sees. She pulls no punches. I know that doesn't surprise you. And then for a novelist and for anyone caring about Lewis's world, the most extraordinary thing happened about 10 years ago. I always do this. In Oxford, England, in a small cottage, in the back of the closet, there was a box. And in that box were 300 unpublished poems of Joy Davidman's, just discovered about 10 years ago. Joy Davidman had a best friend in Oxford named Jean Wakeman. And Joy lived with Jean Wakeman. Joy's son lived with Jean Wakeman after Lewis passed. So Douglas lived with Jean. Well, about 10 years ago, Jean was sick. And she called Douglas and she said, I'm moving out of my house. Can you help me? And Douglas came and he found a box of his mother's papers. Essays, short stories, notes, and 300 unpublished poems that, thank you to Don W. King, is now published, and you can buy them out there after you buy my book. But I'm kidding. But in this 300 poems, there was a folder. And on that folder was written the word courage. And in the cover letter said, 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis. These poems are purposeful. Some of them were written before she met Lewis. And that's what I find so fascinating. Some of them, she did not write all of them after she met him. Some of them had been written in her younger years, when she was struggling with love, when she was trying to figure out who she was, when she was trying to discover if love even meant anything at all. And she compiled those 45 love sonnets. There's great debate we're going to talk about later today whether she ever gave them to him. I know she did. But she wrote those for him, and she put them in order for him, and she wrote a cover letter for him. So back to writing why I wrote about her. I do not have to guess how Joy Davidman felt. Now, I could be getting it wrong in places, but she tells us, if we're there to listen, she tells us about herself. So I didn't have to hear what everybody else thought about her. I could hear from her. I love this quote by C.S. Lewis when he talks about reading. The first demand any work of art makes of us is surrender. That's Lewis, and that is what I did when I started researching Joy. I surrendered to her story. I decided I wasn't going to interview anyone until I was done, or even read some of the literature that gives an opinion on her. I wanted the facts. I was very careful about that. I built a firm skeleton of facts. My office looked like that movie, A Beautiful Mind. I had charts and graphs and when things happened and when things were published, when she said what, when Lewis said what, and I had all that, but I held back from the opinions. Joy often seemed not to care what other people thought of her. I think that was a mask, but I did care. So I'm going to introduce you to her a tiny bit for those of you who don't know her as well as some of us do. Joy was born in April of 1915 to immigrant parents, Polish and Ukrainian immigrant parents, who changed their names to Joseph and Jenny because as immigrant parents in New York in the early 1900s, you cared about assimilating, you cared about becoming part of the community, and you really cared about accomplishment. Her parents were incredibly harsh on her. Her father was a school principal. They say he broke the record for how many people quit under his principal, how many teachers quit. He was harsh, he was cruel. There are stories her brother Howie tells of her parents locking her out of the house and letting her run around the neighborhood screaming to get back in. She talks about being slapped. They pushed her and pushed her and pushed her because this is why. They knew she was a genius. She could read when she was 3 years old. She broke the IQ chart. She hit 150 and they couldn't test her higher. Her brother tested at 140 and they were like, so what? She was a genius in every sense of the word. At 9 years old, she read H.G. Wells' History of the World, marched in and told her family that she was an atheist. When she was 14 years old, she graduated from high school. She finished Columbia Graduate School with a degree in literature in a year and a half. At an age where my son is still a sophomore in college. She wrote a thesis on Lord Orrery that would blow your mind if you could get your hands on it, that this 18-year-old girl wrote this thesis. By her early 20s, she had published a novel. She had won the Yale Younger Poets Award, the Russell Lyons Award for Poetry. She had also been through great heartbreak. She had also been through a tough childhood when she finally met the man of her dreams. No good story really starts that way. His name, she called him the perfect mythical husband. His name was William Gresham, and then we called him Bill. She called him Bill. I call him Bill. And Bill and she bonded over the Spanish Civil War, as well as bonding over communism. At the time, they were both in the Communist Party. And she had written a series of poems called A Comrade in Arms. And much of it was about, and that's what she won the Yale Younger Poets Award for. Meanwhile, Bill had fought in the Spanish Civil War. So they bonded over that, they fell in love, and they went to the MacDowell Artist Colony to get married. Because of all the things Joy was, she was also a prodigy of the MacDowell's Artist Colony. So they married. But Bill had the lurking dragon of what we would now call PTSD from the Spanish Civil War. He saw really horrific things in the Spanish Civil War. He had attempted suicide. He had been in a TB ward. He had a lot of problems from fighting in that war. We have a lot of empathy for him. But I'm writing from Joy's point of view, so I'm not going to have the most empathy I could. So Bill called her one night. They had 2 little kids, 2 and 1 years old, named Davy and Douglas. Joy was home alone when Bill called and said he wasn't coming home, that he was finally going to take his life. And this wasn't an empty threat. He had tried it before. He had threatened it before. He'd been in therapy about it. So she believed him. And she fell on her knees. And she didn't know why she fell on her knees. So I want to read a couple things she says about herself in her words that she felt before this moment. For I was a well-brought up, right-thinking child of materialism. Beauty I knew existed, but God, of course, did not. That's Joy. Here's what she says about imagination and rationalism and how she viewed them. Such as then was my imaginative life. Over against it stood the life of my intellect. The 2 hemispheres of my mind were in the sharpest contrast. On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. Isn't that such a beautiful sentence? On the one side, a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth. On the other, a glib and shallow rationalism. Nearly all that I loved, I believed to be imaginary. Nearly all that I believed to be real, I thought grim and meaningless. So when Joy fell on her knees, she didn't know why she fell on her knees. She didn't know what was happening. She said it lasted about 30 seconds, and her whole heart blew open. She said something or someone was in that room with her, and that something or someone felt very much like love. She didn't at that moment have a name for it. She said later, and God came in. And when people ask me why I wrote about her, I say any transformational journey that begins with the words, and God came in, that is a transformational journey worth telling. So she came out of that, and she eventually wrote an essay called The Longest Way Around about this. And I'm going to read you a few things she said about that experience, because I want you to hear it in her words. She said it was like waking up. Don't you love that? Here is this woman who was the captain of her soul, in charge of her life, winning awards, a communist, a materialist, an atheist. She could argue, debate, quarrel, and win every single time because she was so intelligent that she could just take my brain would have gone to fuzz arguing. I would have never argued with Joy Davidman. And she says, all of a sudden, she woke up. She said she had taken her life watered down, diluted by time and space until that moment. Taken her life watered down, diluted by time and space. She said she saw how much energy she had spent keeping God out. She said if the knowledge of God was true, the thinking of her whole life had been false. Now that's a breaking point. When you realize that the thinking of your whole life is false. And this is not someone who just thought casually. This is a woman who thought for a living. She said she realized that only one religion had the complete understanding of the grace, repentance, and charity that came from God in that 30 seconds on her knees in her son's nursery. And then my favorite quote of hers, which I also keep on a bulletin board in my office, she realized that life is too intense to forever be endured with flesh and blood alone. Don't you love that? Life is too intense to forever be endured with flesh and blood alone. Every time I say that out loud, I get this little lump in my throat. But she didn't realize all of that immediately after this mystical experience. And that's what she called it, a mystical experience. She did not call it a conversion yet. Bill did come home. Bill did not take his life. He came home, and she looked at him and said, God loves us. We're going to be okay. There is something out there. We're going to be okay. But she didn't know what it was. So she went on a 2 or 3 year journey trying to discover what it meant. She went seeking for what it meant. She thought she might return to her family history of Judaism. She looked at Buddhism, Hinduism. She researched all the world religions. And then she remembered an author she had read named Clive Staples Lewis. So to put this in context, by the time this is happening, it is approximately 1948, 1949. Lewis has written The Great Divorce, The Screwtape Letters, Mere Christianity, Pilgrim's Regress. He has not yet published Narnia. So he is not famous for that yet. So in the States, he is well known, but not as well known as he would become. But he had been on the cover of Time magazine, and there had been an incredible article about him in the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which if you were a writer in the 40s and 50s, you read that magazine like a Bible. Everybody published in that magazine. And a man named Chad Walsh, a pastor, a professor, a teacher, a philosopher, named Chad Walsh had written an article in the Atlantic Monthly that Joy read called Apostle to the Skeptics. Chad had spent 6 months living with Lewis at the Kilns. Chad Walsh is the luckiest guy I know. He had spent 6 months just spending day to day with this man and then writing this series of articles that was eventually published into a book called Apostle to the Skeptics. Joy read that. She contacted Chad Walsh and said, I need to talk to this man. She had read his work. She had admired his work. She had thought him brilliant, but wrong. Recently, I was at the Wade Center, and they gave me some things they didn't give me when I was researching the book. Thank you. And it was some books of hers that were by Lewis, but they were her books. She owned them. And she, last night, I loved what you said about arguing versus quarreling. She was arguing with Lewis in the margins of his own book. She was writing in the margins of The Problem of Pain, where she thought he was right, where she thought he was wrong. She wrote to him as if they were having a conversation, which they weren't yet. So she had already read his work. She had already, taken a deep dive, but just believed him to be wrong and kind of fantasy-like. And as by that quote I read you, she loved the world of fantasy. It was her favorite reading subject. And yet she didn't believe in it any other dimension but what you could see until this time. So she wrote to Lewis. Actually, the first letter they say is from her and her husband, that Bill and she wrote to Lewis together. In January of 1950, Lewis wrote her back. And Bill dropped out of the scene by then. He had moved on, and he was into Scientology, Buddhism, and he decided, Joy could take over the correspondence with C.S. Lewis. Big mistake. Big mistake. So Joy and Lewis started an almost 3-year pen friendship that culminated with Joy boarding the SS United States to sail to England in August of 1952. Now, she went to England for loads of reasons. She went to get health care. She had been very sick. And the doctor told her she needed to take a break. She was writing a book about King Charles II, and there was no Google. So she was going over there to go to Edinburgh and do some research, and she was going for some rest. But of course, she was also going to meet her friend Jack. And this is when I say, and then this is where the story gets really good. And not because it gets easy, but because this is when they both have to overcome so many obstacles. Both of them, internal obstacles and external obstacles. They have to overcome society's expectations. They have to overcome their internal misbeliefs. They have to overcome this distance. Here you have the most improbable love story you can imagine. You have this New York born and bred woman. She had never left New York for all of her life, except the 6 months that she wrote screenplays in Hollywood, which she said were the worst 6 months of her life. And she's had some bad 6 months. She hated it out there. She said she ran back to New York kissing subways and skyscrapers. She hated it. Joy had never left New York. She had been born in the Bronx. She had grown up in the Bronx, and at this point in her life, she lived in upstate New York in a farmhouse with her husband and 2 young sons. She was a communist, like I said, an atheist, a materialist, married with 2 kids. Doesn't sound like the perfect match for this Oxford Don, who was over here on the other side of the pond, a man who had never left Ireland or England, except the 6 months in France in a war. A man who lived in a man's world. He lived with his brother in the kilns. He taught at an all-male college. He was a member of an all-male writing group, the Inklings. He was a man's man. He was a devout bachelor. And he was 17 years older than her. As Andrew reminds me, it's like 16 years and 3 months or something, 16 years and 4 months. How are these 2 people, except for some kind of divine intervention, ever supposed to find each other? How are they ever to become friends, much less fall in love, and much less get married? And so that's what I wanted to know. This is a true hero's journey for both of them, not just for Joy, but for both of them. Both of them changed so dramatically during this decade-long relationship, and then Lewis living 3 more years, and his work changed dramatically because of her. So we like to look at the end result, the love story. That's what we look at in Shadowlands. That's what we look at in most of the literature, is this beautiful love story. But there was this whole journey in front of it, this whole journey that Joy made from here to Oxford. And I hadn't seen anybody talk about that except in facts. So what would she say if she were standing here today? What would she say to the Lewis community? What would she say to us as writers or as readers or as intellectuals about asking the bigger questions? I can only guess on this side of her death, but I can tell you some of the things I really believe she would say to us from her own words. Number 1, the writing really matters. It matters. What we're doing here, writing and reading, the words, it matters. Her entire life she wrote. I bet Joy started writing when she could hold a crayon. It wasn't my first career. I think many of us came to this world by a convoluted pathway. She never did. Joy was an extraordinary poet, good at prose, and she never, till the very end of her life, she never stopped writing or editing or collaborating. She would talk to us about the creative power of collaboration and writing and how important it is for our lives and for the transformation of our lives. All of her life, until that moment she fell on her knees, her work, if you read between the lines, her work is screaming, show me that there is something more. I think that's what we're all screaming in between the lines of our work. Show me that there is something more, something greater than what I can see. When she was in her teens, she wrote a poem called Resurrection on Easter Day, where she argued with Jesus about his resurrection. She never stopped searching. She talks, I'm going to read one poem of hers. She has an amazing collection. But she recounts many times, and especially in her essay, The Longest Way Round, about this knowledge she had when she was young that there was something more. But she would put it off to hormones, emotions. She blamed everything but God for these experiences she had. She talks about walking through the forest and everything like the veil falling away, the light on the trees, and knowing, and then it shuts down and the door closes and she knows it was just an emotional reaction. So in 1947, she wrote a poem called Fairy Tale that is about a dream she had for her whole life. Does anybody have recurring dreams? I have the same one all the time. It is not a fairy tale. I am always in a plane that is crashing and nobody knows but me. That is the worst. But she had a recurring dream. Oh, take that one to a Freudian psychiatrist. But Joy had this recurring dream that she was walking along a path, this beautiful grassy pathway, And she was lost and yet also knew where she was going. That she didn't know where she was, but she knew where she was going. And she would walk down this path, and in far away, and she had this dream long before Lewis, long before her conversion, and in the distance was a castle. And she was trying to get to the castle, and the dream would always end before she could get there. And she wrote a poem about it. At night, when we dreamed, we went down a street and turned a corner. We went down the street and turned the corner, and there was the castle. Always, if you knew how to go, you could walk down a street, the daylight street, that twisted about and ended in grass. And there it was, always the castle. Remote, unshadowed, childish, immortal, with two calm giants guarding the portal, stiff in the sunset, strong to defend, stood castle safety at the world's end. Oh, castle safety. Love without crying, honey without cloying, death without dying, hate and heartbreak, all were forgot there. We always woke, we never got there. Joy was obviously searching. If she hadn't written those things, if she hadn't dove into that meaningful writing, would she have ever recognized it when it showed up? Would she have recognized God coming in if she hadn't already taken the time to write and think and listen to her subconscious and to her dreams and to herself? I think the other thing she would talk to us about is asking what the poet David Whyte calls the beautiful questions. She was always willing to ask the questions, always. And she was willing to ask the hard questions and the big questions. David Whyte says there are some questions that can make or unmake a life. Don't you love that? There are some questions that can make or unmake a life. And Joy was willing to ask those questions. And she took a lot of them to our friend Clive Staples Lewis. But she was at least willing to ask. The other thing I think she would really talk to us about as far as the writing life is this way that we can be torn between, and this isn't just for women, but I am going to talk about that because she is a woman, the way we can be torn between our creative life and our duty. She wrote a lot about being torn between motherhood, wifehood, and her creative life. And I know for men, I was just talking to you about being torn between your job and your duty and your creative life. And I know that she would say to us that you do everything you can to sustain your creative life. Everything you can. I say in the book, these are not her words, these are mine, that she says to Lewis, I feel like I walk a tightrope. On one side is motherhood, wifehood, and household duties. And on the other side is my life. And I constantly fall off, and the person I injure is myself. But she didn't give up. She continued to try to walk that tightrope. And what if she had stopped? What if she had listened to society's expectations? She would have never written that poetry. She would have never written to Lewis. She would have never changed her life or the life of our beloved author if she had quit. She wanted to find something that would satisfy her heart, her logic, and her experience. Aren't we all? Trying to find what would satisfy her heart, her logic, and her experience. And that is why she didn't give up. I think she would talk a lot to us about pain and what we do with our pain. What she did was build a really strong armor. If anybody ever uses that word, I'm not going to say again, that I don't like, that I told you at the beginning. If anybody calls her that, it's because of that armor she built around her very vulnerable, very soft, very wounded soul. She built an armor of intelligence, witty bon mots, very Dorothy Parker, very in your face, but that was her armor until she let it fall off. Until we have faces, she took off her veil. Until she allowed and accepted her true self, real love was never going to happen, and neither was real work. And so I think she would talk to us about using our pain in a different way than building an armor. I think she would talk to us about our true worthiness in Christ. We might not all need to pack up our kids and move to England, but we might need to pack up what everybody else tells us who we should be. We might need to pack up who the world tells us we should be. What is successful, what isn't, how we should act, how we shouldn't act, what we should write about, what we shouldn't write about. We need to pack all of that up, and I think she would tell us to do that because that's what she did. The other thing I love is that I really think, or know, she would talk to us about keeping our eyes open for the unseen threads in our lives. Watching, and Andrew talked about this in the very first session about how he sees that when these weekends are over, whether it's here or in Oxford or any gathering of such like-minded people, when you get to the end, you see three threads you had never seen at the beginning of the weekend. You see that there is a theme that naturally, by the Holy Spirit, by God, by coincidence, whatever you want to believe, shows up. And Joy would tell us to keep our eyes out for that. I'm going to give you some of the unseen threads that bound these two people together. They were both geniuses. They both struggled with the internal dichotomy between reason and imagination until they let that barrier break down. They were both atheists who only believed in the material world. In her essay, she calls herself the world's most astonished atheist. And I know you know what Lewis called himself, the world's most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. Do these phrases sound mirroring? Astonished atheist and reluctant convert. That was Joy and Jack. They both were completely mystified and enchanted and fascinated with mythology for all of their life, both of them. Lewis, as we know, was completely enchanted with Norse mythology and Celtic mythology, and so was Joy. Joy had a lifelong fascination with lions. When she was a child, she used to sneak out in the middle of the night with her brother Howie and sneak out to the Bronx Zoo and go to the lion cage. And the lions would let her feed them. When she went to Hollywood, she helped raise Leo, the MGM lion. She said that was the only pleasurable part of being in Hollywood, was raising that lion. She writes about lions in her poetry. There is a poem for her sons that says, "Let us be lions, lions walking through the forest under the leaves." And then who saunters on the scene? Aslan. Joy read and was particularly and profoundly impacted by George MacDonald's Phantastes. She says that that book led her to Lewis's work. And what does Lewis say about Phantastes? It baptized his imagination. This book that they found almost at the same age, 17 years apart, both led them to the same thing. The same book, not the same kind of book, the same book. They both originally wanted to be poets, and Joy was. That was her trade. Joy won, like I said, the Yale Younger Poets Award and the Russell Lyons Poet Award in the 20s. I was leafing through my Poet and Writer magazine the other day, and I noticed that they just released a volume of the 100-year anniversary of the Yale Younger Poets Award. And Joy has 3 poems in there. She was no poetry slouch. She had wanted to be and was a poet all of her life. And as you all know, because you love Lewis so, that was his original desire. He wanted to be a poet. And the first work he published was a book of poems. And it wasn't under his real name. He wrote it under Clive Hamilton. And that is his real name, but he didn't write it under Lewis. So they both originally wanted to be poets. Lewis was profoundly enamored with Joy's poetry and success at poetry. So the unseen threads that bind our lives together, how often do we miss them because we're not looking for them? No, Joy would tell us to look for them. So why historical fiction? Why did I write about Joy in a novel? Why did I not make it biography? Why did I tell her in a story? Because I believe in the power of story. I'm a novelist. I'm not a biographer. She was my 14th novel, and I believe in the power of story to tell a greater truth. I believe in the power of story to reach people who would never pick up a biography or the profoundly impactful journal at the Wade Center, The Seven. People who would never even know about it or pick it up would pick up a novel. And the power of story would introduce Joy to a world and an audience that would never have heard about her. So that's why I wrote about her into a novel. C.S. Lewis is one of my favorites, and he's talking about reading. And he says, we see our being. We want in story to be more than ourselves. Isn't that amazing? That's why I put her in a story. He also says, we want to see with others' eyes, to imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as our own. So that's why I wrote about Joy in a novel. So I believe that if she was standing here, she'd have dark hair and be taller, but she would say that with writing, with beautiful questions, by looking for the unseen threads in our lives, by living in our true worthiness in Christ, with creative collaboration and friendship, with seeking, by taking off our masks, by cracking our facades, by walking through and not around our pains, we and our work can become who and what they were created to be. Joy shows us that the search for truth with a capital T and the search for love with a capital L is worth the convoluted and complicated path of changing our lives. Thank you. Take loads of questions. Okay, now it's your turn. What do y'all want to talk about?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. We've got
Peter
some
has a
questions.
question. Right there.
Did you talk at all with Doug about the impressions of his mom?
Yeah.
And how much did that weave into the fabric of your book?
He asked, oh, you could hear him. He had a microphone. I'm used to this whole thing where you repeat the question. Doug, so he asked me if I had spoken with Douglas. Douglas is Joy's only remaining son. Davy passed away, 6 years ago? Oh, was it really only that? Okay. I knew he had passed away by the time I started writing this novel. So that's a great question. And the short answer is yes, but I'm not good with short answers. So I made, as I said in the beginning, a very firm decision that I was going to write from her point of view. So I interviewed loads of people, but not till I had finished the first draft. And had written the book the way I felt like Joy, out of Joy's voice, like how she would have wanted the story told. So I knew that I would eventually have to talk to Douglas. And those who know anything about Douglas know he lives in Malta. It's not like I could go ask him for tea. So I also knew that he was incredibly hard to get a hold of. I had asked the Wade Center, and they said, if you ever want to talk to him, we will have to ask him permission to contact you. They also told me that about Andrew. So I knew that I would have to talk to him because nothing is published, as you know, in the C.S. Lewis world without Douglas's permission. And so I knew that I would eventually have to talk to him and get some permission because those poems I told you about, each chapter begins with a piece of her poetry. And I felt that that was a really important backbone to the story. It was my backbone to the story. When I got lost, which I did, because there's so many interesting things about Joy, it could have been a trilogy. But no one wants to wait 3 books to see them kiss. And so I had to trim it down. And so whenever I got lost, I used her poetry as a backbone, and I wanted you to have that same backbone for the novel. I also put real words in their mouths, and I needed permission for that. So I could have published the book without his permission, but not in the form you have it now. But I had put it off. I was a little bit like Scarlett. I'll worry about that tomorrow. Tomorrow's another day when I can find Douglas. And so I put it aside, and the book was finished. And my agent had it, and we were taking it to market. And if there's any authors here, you know there's nothing more anxiety-producing than when your book is out to market. You take to the bed, usually. And it was out to market, and I got an email that said, "Hello, Patty. I'm not going to keep doing that. My name is Douglas Gresham, and I hear you have been asking after my mother. I was like, I'm dead in the water. This is it, you know. How can I help you? So I called my agent, and I said, what do I do? And she said, how about you tell him the truth? I was like, great idea. So I wrote back to him, and I said, Douglas, I have written a novel about your mother. And I've written about a novel about your mother because I want to honor her. I've written a novel about your mother from her point of view because I want to not only reintroduce her to my generation of women who only know her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis, but I want to introduce her to a new generation of women who need to hear what she says about life being too intense to forever be endured with only logic. And I went on, and I waited, and he wrote back, bravo. I was like, phew. So then we talked on the phone for a bit. We emailed, we talked on the phone, and I was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, speaking at a library when I said, well, where are you, and how did you get my number or email? And he said, I'm in the States doing a speaking tour, and I was at the Wade Center, and your name and Andrew Lazo's name was on every single folder of my mother's. And I asked who you were, and they said that you would love to talk to me. And he said, but right now I'm in Asheville. And I said, I'm an hour away, do not move. And he didn't, and so I went and spent the morning and the afternoon with him, and he told me stories, and I did go back and add a little bit of that, but mostly I just listened to him. I had already written the book. I added a few things he told me because they were fun, but I didn't alter the story in any way for what he told me. And then we have kept in great touch. I was very nervous about what he would think about the book, so I never asked. And we would email, and sometimes I would find an article or hear a lecture and shoot him, what do you think about this? And we'd talk about it. But I didn't ask him what he thought about my work. And then one day, I received an email that said, from a stranger, that said, have you heard this? And it was a podcast with Douglas. And she says, the podcaster asks him what he thinks of your book. I didn't listen to it for a couple hours because my heart was in my throat. And he couldn't be any nicer about it. You know, my favorite quote, and I've heard him say it a number of times now at different events, is that it's as accurate or more accurate than most biographies and essays written about his mother, only because of the emotional truth instead of the facts, not because it's better than. So, yes, I have talked to Douglas. So, yes would have been fine, right? Okay. She hasn't made there.
Joy Davidman appears in most of Lewis's biographies, but there are only 2 biographies about her, and one was by Lyle Dorset, the other by Abby Santa Maria. And this is, I think, by far, even though it's a supposal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Lewis
That's a
would
good
do.
way to say it, yes.
Yeah.
A supposal. I did interview Lyle because God has such a great sense of irony, and Lyle lives about 2 miles away from me in Birmingham, Alabama. And at the time, he was the pastor at the Anglican Church at Samford University and a professor. And so this was years ago. And when I was finished the novel, like I said, I did not travel to London and Oxford nor interview anyone. And I interviewed loads of people until I was done the rough draft. So I went to visit Lyle and have this conversation with him about Joy. I think, in hindsight, I think I was making sure we agreed. But he told me he had 10 minutes for me. I was like, I'll take it. And we talked for like an hour and a half. And have you ever thought about writing a novel about her? And I froze. I was like, do I tell him I already did it? And I didn't. And I left and I wrote him a couple weeks later. I was like, I actually already wrote a novel about her. But he was thrilled. He just felt like so much more information had come out and her poetry had come out, and so much more had come out since he had written that book in the late 70s, early 80s. And he was able to do things I wasn't able to do, which is like interview Howie and interview Renee. And so I stand on the shoulders of a lot of that interviewing and work that Lyle did. So.
There's a wonderful essay by Diana Glyer about Joy Davidman, and that's probably the best prose about her.
I agree. It's beautiful.
The biographies are good, but I think that it's wonderful. The most accurate portrayal of who she was as a woman would not come in nonfiction, but would come in fiction.
Yeah.
Isn't that appropriate to our author? Yes? We have a question here.
Can you tell us about your conversion from pediatric nurse to full-time writer?
I thought you were going to ask about my real conversion. I'm like, I grew up as a preacher's kid. I've had like 9 conversions. Because you want to make sure it sticks. You got to keep asking Jesus in your heart or it's not going to stick. I'm just being here at Camp Allen. This is my whole life, like youth retreats, camp retreats, church retreats. From pediatric nurse to writer, I'll make this quick. I was always a powerful lover of reading. I always had my nose in a book. I used to get in trouble for reading. Are my people here? Who got in trouble for, right? Get your nose out of that book. Oh, right, because you're so much more interesting than Rhett and Scarlett. But sure, I'd love to join you in the real world, not. So I was a total avid bookworm reader. I read all the time, but nobody in the 70s told me, and that's not anybody's fault, I could have decided it by myself, but nobody told me that writing was a thing you could do. Right? I always believed that authors were just people on book flaps. To me, the book was the living thing. So I have this great story of why I decided to write, and it's ironic because her son is here with us today, her stepson, but who's here is an Ann Rivers Siddons fan? One of my favorite writers of all time. She writes in the South and writes about the South and in the South, and she went to Auburn. I went to Auburn. She was in a sorority, I was in a sorority. She lived in Atlanta, I lived in Atlanta, and she was a human being. And I went to meet her, and it hit me that people write books. And I was playing dollhouse with my 5-year-old daughter. So I had my master's degree in pediatrics. I was working as a nurse, and I was playing dollhouse with my 5-year-old daughter, and I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I was basically trying to stay awake because I had a 3-year-old and 1-year-old sons. And she said, "When I grow up, I want to be a writer of books." And it was just this simple, pure, and beautiful statement. She didn't say, "I want to be a New York Times bestseller, I want to be an author." She said, "I want to be a writer of books." And I know why she said it. She said it because our time alone was when I read to her every night. One more book, one more book, one more book. And I said, "No, that's what I want to be when I grow up." And she said, "You're already grown up." And the next day, I signed up for a writing class at Emory. So that's my story. So. Any other questions?
Yeah, we got one right over here.
Okay, we have a good 10 minutes. I left loads of time.
Well, I appreciate your book from hearing about it.
Thank you.
Can men also buy it?
They must.
Yes. Okay. Seriously,
Yeah, they must.
What do you feel like it has for men?
I feel like a transformation, like I said, a transformational journey that begins with "and God came in" is for all of us. And I also feel like she is us and we are her, whether we're male or female. A lot of her journey really resonates with women a little more, if it is a little more. It's because of the struggle between wifehood, motherhood, societal expectations of a woman in the 40s. It does resonate as a whole, resonates with all of us. The struggle between intellectualism and logic and heart and imagination, pulling aside the veil, believing it, trying to understand experience versus logic. And I think as a male, if you love Lewis's work, which is one of the things I did in the research, I read I can't read everything. I always say everything, but you can't. I read as much as I could of the work that he wrote after he met her. And Andrew and I will talk about this later, but most notably, of course, Till We Have Faces, which she co-authored with him. You're not going to convince me otherwise. But the work that she helped edit, her fingerprint about love, about strong women, you can see his work shift after he met her. So her story matters as not as much as her journey, but if you care about Lewis, you need to care about who she was to him. So it's a resounding yes, it's for men. I know they put a woman on the cover, and we argued about it for a while, but I let it go. So
I'm gonna owe you a beer.
Okay.
Because I disagree with you.
Oh.
I think it is not more
Shocking.
for women. Yeah. I don't think it's more for women. As a man, reading this book and knowing lopsidedly about Lewis, I don't know enough about his emotional life or their relationship. And so reading the emotional authenticity that was in your novel and nowhere else published about Joy Davidman really helps to put the picture together. And so as a man, I loved reading the book. Part of it is
Thank you.
because, of course, I love Lewis, but it fills in gaps. But even more than my interest in Lewis, if you are interested at all in human relationships and how we survive the shipwreck of love that was her first marriage and get to a place where we can find some grudging contentment and make some peace with life.
Yeah.
If you're awake and human and alive, this
And
book
have
is
any
for you.
brokenness that you're trying to get
Especially
through.
men. And if you're married to women or know women or love women, this book is for you, and I don't get a cut of the profits.
Is there any talk of becoming Mrs. Lewis into a one-woman show a la Max McLean's Fellowship
Oh,
of
that's a
Performing
great
Arts?
idea. I was joking. That's so funny you said that. I was joking with Andrea this morning. I said, I should just put on a black wig and just pretend I'm her and tell you what I think. But I'm not smart enough to be her. I can just talk about her. But but that's a brilliant idea. You give Max a little ring. Tell him that. I think it's a great idea. A one-woman show, or even what is that play they have? It just hit me where it's an imaginary of Freud and Lewis arguing. Yeah. Something like that. It would be interesting. Yes, ma'am.
I won't say too much, but Max is a friend, and we have done some work together, and I would be lying to say if such conversations haven't at least happened. So,
But y'all can easily, as a
Right.
group, email him and say, we think this would be a great idea.
and Max is deeply intrigued by C.S. Lewis, obviously.
He spent his whole life on
His
C.S.
latest stage play, Most Reluctant Convert, ends at the conversion, and he has openly wondered in the program what happens next. And so he's actively thinking about some of those things. And Max and the Fellowship for Performing Arts do a season, I think at the Pearl Theater, every fall. And last year, I think they did Shadowlands. It's too big a show to take on the road, but he's deeply intrigued by Joy, is aware of and loves Patty's book. And so I don't know and wouldn't even deign to speak for Max, but I think that it is rife with dramatic possibilities.
I agree.
Could you speak a little bit more about the difference between the novel approach and biography?
Yeah, she asked the different approaches between novel and biography. In biography, I've never written one, so and never will. Well, never say never. If somebody would have told me I was going to write this, I would have said, what? In biography, you can't suppose how someone feels, or you shouldn't suppose how someone feels. You shouldn't, in strict biography, there's a new category called creative nonfiction, and that you can do. But if you're writing a strict biography, I don't believe that it's proper to say, and this is exactly how they felt. You can say this is exactly what they said, but in the power of story and fiction, I can embody those emotions in a way that you can't in biography. And you can embody and supposal. I love that word. We actually talked about it before. When Lewis talks about Narnia, he says it's a supposal, right? So becoming Mrs. Lewis is me supposing I am her. We don't have the letters they wrote to each other, right? They're gone. Sadly, horrifically, they're gone. Unless Douglas is telling a little fib and they're hidden somewhere. But I asked him outright, and he said they're gone. But those letters are imperative to the story, right? They fell in love, if they fell in love at all, in a philia way, in those letters. And we know they did because he very early on asked her to call him Jack. And only his dearest friends called him Jack. And he called her Joy. Very early on in their correspondence. And so, and we know that because she told somebody else, not because we have the letters. So here we have these letters that are gone, and yet for me, they're imperative to the story because that's where they bonded. So I had to imagine or suppose what was said in those letters. And the way that I imagined or supposed what was said in those letters was by reading all the other letters they wrote to other people during that time. And I asked myself, what were they concerned about during that time? What was going on in the world at that time? The atom bomb. Joy was freaked out about the atom bomb. She wrote poems about it. She wrote a poem to her sons that says, "You are born in this dark age of the atom bomb." World War II had just finished. She sent him a ham because they were under food rations. I needed to know those things if those letters are going to feel authentic to you. So I read the letters they wrote to other people. I read what they cared about. It was about the time that Lewis quit the Socratic Club. Am I saying that right? And so I knew that they would be talking to each other about those things. I knew that she would talk to him about her marriage because she told other people what Lewis said about her marriage. So I was able to suppose those letters, but you can't stick those in a biography. So that's why I believe in the power of story in that way. So I hope that makes sense.
We have 3 more folks who I'll get to for questions. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left to answer those.
Okay.
I think that the concept of voice in writing, fiction or nonfiction, is imperative, and that's one of the things that struck me about this novel is how accurate her voice sounds. I read your book and go, oh, that's what Joy would have sounded like. And
Well, I
that's a rare
immersed
thing.
myself in her work to the point where I had to write an essay about something else. I was like, whoa, Patty, no. Who was I talking to about writing earlier? And we were talking about trying to find your voice. I said it's also imperative to discover what isn't your voice when you're starting to write. Yes.
I've always loved the quote that, we make our art and our art makes us.
Absolutely.
It's kind of a twist on Winston Churchill. But that being said, when you go through and you do that much work on creating a novel and you're inside somebody else's skin,
Yeah.
how did writing this change you?
Oh, I was hoping we were going to get away without that today. Our time is now up. No, oh gosh, writing about a woman like Joy David-Mann can't help but change you. It's probably an entire essay that I need to take some time to sit down and write. It's been, Joy's story came out about a year ago, and it has been the wildest ride. So I need to take some time to clarify what that means for me, but I said this in the little writing class we had, if you were in there, where I said one of my other favorite quotes is by John O'Donohue, the Irish philosopher and poet, who says that imagination is always an act toward wholeness, or should be an act toward wholeness. And writing this book was very much an act toward wholeness. It was, I surrendered to this work in a way I didn't my other work. I wrote it in secret. I didn't tell anybody I was writing it. Even when I did my research at the Wade Center, I did not tell them what I was doing. I just did my research. My agent knew, and she said we'd figure it out whenever I was ready because it was so different than my other work. And I told a very dear friend of mine who writes historical fiction because I wanted someone to bounce things off of, Paula McLean, who wrote The Paris Wife. But other than that, I kept it to myself. It was between me and Joy and God. And but she taught me so much. Most of what she taught me, I said in what she would say to us today. The importance of asking the bigger questions, of not being able to be afraid to ask the bigger questions, about being willing to seek. I love these 2 bookend statements. Joy, at the end of The Longest Way Round, says, "In his will is our peace," which of course we know is Dantean. And then the last words on earth were, "I am at peace with God." So between these 2 bookend statements, "In his will is our peace" and "I am at peace with God," was this 10-year journey of hardship and tragedy, but never giving up and being willing to ask the questions. She didn't hit the rough patches and say, "I'm done, I give up." She kept going, and she didn't lose her faith, and she didn't lose the knowing of the indwelling Christ in her. She just didn't always know what to do with it. So, yeah, she's taught me a lot about the importance of those things. And we don't have very similar personalities. I'm much more of I don't want to make anybody upset or mad. And so she has taught me a little bit about that being okay. just a little
We're going
bit.
to take 2 more quick questions, and
And
we'll-
more, I'll write about it.
Patty and I will do a session on their collaboration this afternoon from 3:30 to 4:30, and we'll
Yeah.
take more questions there. But I've got one over here,
Okay.
and then we'll be done.
Oh, I could do this all day, we're good.
This might be better suited for the collab session, but I'm curious if, as you were reading through Joy so deeply, so intimately, so consistently, if you found any phrases, terms of art that I've been attributing to Lewis that I should be attributing to Joy.
No, I don't think there's anything, Andrew is going to have to chime in
Yeah.
here, but I don't think there's anything you would attribute to her, but I think you would say her fingerprints are on it.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And we're definitely, that's on the agenda for this afternoon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think anything's outright hers, but there is a boatload of, well, that sounds an awful lot like, just even the, astonished atheist and the reluctant convert. These are mirroring statements. She wrote hers first. He read it.
And
So
Don-
he's not copying her, but they just mirror each other in these ways. Yeah.
And Don King suggests that her conversion story, Longest Way Round, served as a model for Surprised by
Brought
Joy,
joy.
which came out a couple of years later.
And if
question.
you read, he has a whole about 3-page essay in, it might be, I forget which book it's in. I think it's in Yet One More Spring. And he gives like 6 examples of places where they echo each other. He echoes her.
Thank you for your really thoughtful presentation, and I apologize for not having read your book yet.
Don't apologize.
But in one of Lewis's biographers, he makes this statement: most of Lewis's friends were baffled by Lewis's marriage to Joy Davidman, but it especially baffled his best friend J.R. Tolkien.
Yep.
Why?
You have to ask him. I do put it in the book. I have her have an encounter with Tolkien that I imagine, it's a supposal, but it happened. And probably more than once or twice or 3 times. So I'm going to let Andrew chime in when I'm done. But I believe that, but I believe there were loads of reasons, most of them having to do with Tolkien's firm Catholicism and firm belief. Number one, when Joy showed up in England, she was a married woman with 2 kids. And Lewis was obviously wanting to be around her. He was around her a lot, even on her first visit. And then after she moved, even more so. I think that Tolkien didn't kin kindly to women who could hang out in the pub and outsmart and out-lecture and
Out-drink.
argue. Yeah. I think that the fact that she was married and then divorced didn't sit well with him. And I think that Tolkien is an amazing, brilliant, very kind, loved his wife passionately. He also had a very firm view of the place of women in that time, and Joy didn't fit in that paradigm for him. But like I said about her voice mattering, when it comes to who liked her and who didn't, the only people that mattered to me, the only opinions that mattered to me were Jack and Warnie. Because they loved her. Obviously, Jack did, but even Warnie loved her so deeply that when she passed, Jack wanted to turn to Warnie for comfort, but he was on a bender. He was brokenhearted, devastated when she was gone. They were writing together. They were writing a book together. She did the appendixes on Warnie's book, his history books, indexes, whatever word you want to use. So, yeah. What do you think?
I think that I'm going to give this phrase for a 15-minute answer, but I would argue very vigorously about what that author meant by best friend. Because if anybody was Lewis's best friend, it was Joy Davidman, but there's 15 minutes worth of implications underneath that, and we can
Well, maybe
have that
best friend
conversation.
before Joy Davidman. Maybe.
20 minutes.
There we go.
So how about a
Okay,
big hand for
I see
our
Stephen over there, so.